When Elizabeth Hartwell's grandfather left her $260,000, she thought it was the fresh start she'd been praying for. Instead, the estate attorney called with a problem he'd never seen before. A beneficiary update had been filed, the funds already dispersed. Elizabeth had never signed a thing. So she pulled the notary's official logbook and the ID scan on file, and there, sitting in her chair, holding a fake driver's license with Elizabeth's name, was her own cousin, Stephanie. The timestamp placed her there at 3:15 p.m. on a Tuesday, a time Elizabeth could prove she was 30 miles away at work. But that was just the first crime Stephanie committed. What Elizabeth didn't know was that Stephanie had stolen before. The $260,000 was not a desperate act. It was a pattern. Elizabeth's fight wasn't just about getting her money back. It was about exposing a fraud that had been hiding in plain sight for years. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the source of the money. Elizabeth's grandfather, Harrison Hartwell, had spent 40 years building a modest construction supply business in upstate New York. He was a man of habit. Every Friday, he'd walk into the same diner, order the same club sandwich, and pay with cash. He distrusted banks but loved his family. When he passed away in January, his estate was straightforward: a house, a small investment portfolio, and the life insurance policy he'd taken out decades earlier. The total inheritance for Elizabeth, his only grandchild he'd named in the will, came to $260,000. Elizabeth was 33, working as an ultrasound technician. That money was supposed to be her down payment on a home, the thing her grandfather had always encouraged her to do. The probate process moved slowly, as it does, and Elizabeth waited patiently. She didn't need the money immediately. That's why, when her cousin Stephanie asked to borrow some family photographs and documents for a family history project, Elizabeth didn't think twice. Stephanie was the daughter of Elizabeth's aunt, a woman who had struggled with money and stability her whole life. But she was family. The documents included copies of estate paperwork that Elizabeth had left in her home office. In hindsight, it was the biggest mistake she would ever make. 6 weeks after the estate had supposedly closed, Elizabeth's phone rang. It was the estate attorney, a man named Mark Dolan. His voice was tight. "Elizabeth, I'm calling because there's been a discrepancy. A beneficiary update was filed in your name 3 weeks ago, redirecting the funds to a joint account. The disbursement processed. The money is gone." Elizabeth's blood stopped. She had never signed a beneficiary update. She had never opened a joint account. She told Dolan this and he went silent. Then he said, "Then someone impersonated you, and they did it in front of a notary." What Elizabeth learned next is the crack in the system that allowed identity fraud to flourish. When a notary witnesses a signature, they log the event by recording the signer's name, the type of identification used, and the date and exact time. Some notaries even scan the ID itself. In a world of high-tech crime, this low-tech logbook is often the only forensic proof of who actually sat in that chair. Elizabeth requested that logbook and the scanned image from the notary's office immediately. When the file arrived, she opened it and saw a face she recognized. The photo showed Stephanie, wearing a fake driver's license with Elizabeth's name and address but with Stephanie's own photograph. The logbook timestamp read 3:15 p.m. on a Tuesday in late April. Elizabeth's mind raced. She wasn't just out of the office. She was scanning a patient at the cardiology clinic, a fact she could prove with time-stamped medical records and employee badge swipes. Her own cousin had walked in, sat down, and stolen a future that wasn't hers. But as Elizabeth would soon discover, this wasn't the first time Stephanie had done this, and proving it would mean pulling up a crime that had already been buried. The first thing Elizabeth did was call the police. The second thing she did was realize the police might not be enough. She presented the notary logbook, the doctored ID scan, and her time-stamped work records to a detective named Angela Ruiz. Detective Ruiz listened, took notes, and then said the one sentence every fraud victim dreads: "This is a civil matter. The notary didn't break the law if they were deceived, and the bank followed procedure. Proving criminal intent is going to take more than a logbook." Elizabeth walked out of the precinct not deflated but furious. She understood why the system failed. For law enforcement, identity fraud was a mountain of cases, and unless the dollar amount was astronomical or the evidence was airtight, it got buried. But Elizabeth was not willing to bury this. She started mapping Stephanie's life like an investigator. She pulled public records, social media, and family gossip. She learned that Stephanie had bounced between jobs for years, had a string of evictions, and yet always seemed to have just enough money to survive. The question was, Where was that money coming from? Elizabeth contacted a private forensic accountant, a woman named Corrine Foley, who specialized in tracing hidden assets. Corrine agreed to take the case on a reduced fee because the pattern she saw in Elizabeth's documentation was not new to her. When a person commits identity fraud against a family member, Corrine explained, they almost never do it once. It's a progression. They test the system, learn its weaknesses, and then they escalate. The question isn't if she did this before, it's who else she hurt. That word, progression, lodged itself in Elizabeth's brain. She thought back to family conversations, the offhand remarks her aunt had made about Stephanie helping an elderly neighbor with paperwork. That neighbor was a woman named Ruth Kavanaugh, a 74-year-old retired schoolteacher who lived 2 doors down from Stephanie's childhood home. Elizabeth vaguely remembered Ruth from years ago, a sweet woman who baked cookies for the neighborhood kids. She had passed away in 2022. Her estate had been modest, but Elizabeth recalled whispers at the funeral about complications with the will. Elizabeth obtained the probate file for Ruth Kavanaugh through a public records request. Files showed that a beneficiary change had been filed 8 months before Ruth's death, redirecting a $40,000 certificate of deposit to Stephanie. The document was notarized. The notary's logbook from that transaction had never been subpoenaed because no one had contested it. Ruth's only surviving relative, a nephew in Oregon, had assumed she'd changed her mind about her estate. He'd been too grief-stricken to fight. Elizabeth tracked down that nephew, a man named David, and told him her story. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "My aunt was sharp. She never mentioned Stephanie as a beneficiary. But when I asked about it, the nursing home staff said Stephanie had been visiting every week with papers for her to sign. I thought she was just being helpful." Elizabeth asked if he would be willing to pursue the fraud now, with her evidence as leverage. He agreed. Together, they went back to Detective Ruiz with the new files. 2 notarized documents, 2 different victims, 1 common perpetrator. The pattern was now undeniable. Detective Ruiz reopened the case, this time as a criminal investigation. Elizabeth learned something chilling during the process. The notary who had stamped Ruth's document was the same notary who had stamped the fraudulent one for Elizabeth's inheritance. Not just the same type of fraud, but the exact same notary. That meant Stephanie had either found an incompetent public official or something more sinister. The notary, a mobile notary named Lyle Kinsey, had a clean record but a high volume of complaints on consumer forums, all dismissed for lack of evidence. Elizabeth's stomach turned. This wasn't a random choice. Stephanie had found her weak link. The pivot came when Elizabeth confronted her aunt, Stephanie's mother, about the fraud. Her aunt broke down. She admitted that years earlier, when Ruth's money disappeared, Stephanie had suddenly paid off all her credit card debt. The aunt had suspected but stayed silent. She then revealed something else. There was a third victim, a local handyman who'd sold a car under a fake power of attorney. Elizabeth felt the ground shift beneath her. Stephanie hadn't just committed serial fraud. She'd built a life on it. With David's cooperation and her aunt's reluctant testimony, Elizabeth now had enough to present to the district attorney. But Stephanie had gone quiet. She'd stopped answering calls, moved out of her apartment, and deleted her social media. The investigation was about to hit a wall. And then Elizabeth's phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. It was Stephanie. "You think you're so smart, but you don't know what else I have. Meet me or you'll never find the money." The line went dead. Elizabeth stared at the screen. The fraud that had started with a fake license was now a direct threat. She had a choice: walk away with the criminal case already filed or step into a trap to uncover the full extent of a crime that had been buried for years. She called Detective Ruiz, then she called Corrine Foley. Then she made a decision that would change everything. Elizabeth did not go alone. She contacted Detective Ruiz and told her about the message. They arranged a controlled meeting at a diner on Route 9, the kind of place where truckers and traveling salesmen stopped for coffee, and the booths had high backs that absorbed sound. Detective Ruiz placed a plainclothes officer 2 tables over. Elizabeth wore a wire. Corrine Foley sat in an unmarked car in the parking lot, recording everything on her laptop. The plan was simple: get Stephanie to incriminate herself. What Elizabeth didn't know was how much more she would reveal. Stephanie walked in 20 minutes late, wearing a cheap leather jacket and a nervous smile. She slid into the booth and immediately tried to control the narrative. "Look, this is all a misunderstanding. I needed a loan. I was going to pay you back. If you drop the case, I can give you $50,000 by the end of the month." Elizabeth kept her voice steady. "The money wasn't yours to loan. How did you even get the notary to sign off?" Stephanie leaned in, lowering her voice, not realizing she was sealing her own fate. Lyle takes a cut. He's been doing this for years. He knows how to make documents look clean. I'm not the only one who used him. That sentence, "I'm not the only one," hit Elizabeth like a freight train. She pressed further, asking how many others there were. Stephanie, believing she was negotiating a settlement, started talking about clients and regulars. She mentioned a woman in a nursing home in Poughkeepsie, a veteran in Albany, a small business owner in Schenectady whose property had been signed over using a fake power of attorney. The fraud that began as a single inheritance theft was now a sprawling criminal enterprise, and the notary, Lyle Kinsey, was at the center of it. Detective Ruiz had everything she needed. As soon as Stephanie left the diner, Ruiz's team moved. They seized Stephanie's laptop and phone under a warrant obtained that afternoon. What they found was a spreadsheet. Column A was a list of names, dozens of people, mostly elderly, mostly vulnerable. Column B listed the document types: wills, deeds, power of attorney forms, beneficiary designations. Column C had dollar amounts. The total was staggering: over $1.4 million siphoned from 37 victims across 3 states. Kinsey's notary stamp appeared on every single file. The pair had been operating for over a decade, targeting people who were too isolated or too trusting to fight back. Among the spreadsheet entries, one name stood out to Elizabeth: a charitable trust that her grandfather had quietly supported for 20 years, the Hudson Valley Senior Assistance Fund. Stephanie had impersonated Elizabeth to redirect a $25,000 donation that Harrison Hartwell had pledged before his death. It wasn't just a cousin stealing an inheritance. It was a systematic dismantling of a family's legacy, a theft not just from Elizabeth, but from the community her grandfather had loved. Detective Ruiz arrested Lyle Kinsey at his home that evening. Inside his office, they found a duffel bag with $15,000 in cash and a rubber stamp kit with blank notary seals from 5 different states. He had been forging notarizations for people he never met, printing fake log entries, and creating a paper trail that looked authentic to anyone who didn't dig too deep. But the logbooks themselves became the counter-evidence. The timestamps, the photo scans, the fingerprint records that some states now require, they were all digital, all date-coded, all immutable. Kinsey had been too lazy to cover his tracks, and now every fraudulent transaction was permanently etched into a system designed to prevent exactly this kind of crime. The DA consolidated the cases. David from Oregon added his Aunt Ruth's file. 3 more victims from the spreadsheet came forward with their own stories. Elizabeth sat through the preliminary hearings, watching Stephanie's face remain impassive as the charges piled up. Second-degree grand larceny, forgery, identity theft, conspiracy to commit fraud. The notary logbook that had seemed like a simple piece of paper had become the cornerstone of a prosecution that would put both of them behind bars. But the final twist came when Corinne Foley traced the money. The majority of the stolen funds had been funneled through a series of shell accounts and eventually landed in a small cryptocurrency exchange. Stephanie had been converting cash into digital currency, preparing to disappear into a life that couldn't be seized. She had a plane ticket booked to a country without an extradition treaty. The day after the arrest, she was scheduled to board a flight. If Elizabeth had waited just 48 more hours, the money would have been gone forever. The investigation was complete. The evidence was overwhelming. All that remained was for Elizabeth to sit in a courtroom, look her cousin in the eye, and watch the system her grandfather had trusted finally deliver justice. But Stephanie still had one card left to play. She had not yet said why she did it. And that answer would change how Elizabeth saw everyone in her family, including herself. The reason Stephanie did it came out during her allocution, just before the judge handed down the sentence. She stood at the defendant's table, her voice flat, and she said, "Elizabeth had everything. The perfect job, the perfect boyfriend, the grandfather who left her everything because she was the one who showed up for Sunday dinners. I was the one who got eviction notices and maxed out credit cards. I thought if I just took a little, it would balance the scales. But it never did, so I took more." It was not an apology. It was a confession of envy so deep it had calcified into a belief that theft was justice. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for being unmoved by theatrics, looked over her glasses and said, "Miss Hartwell, you defrauded your own cousin, a deceased senior, and over 30 other people, many of them elderly and alone. This wasn't balance. This was predation." She sentenced Stephanie to 6 to 12 years in state prison for the first set of charges, with additional counts to run concurrently. Lyle Kinsey, the notary who had sold his stamp to anyone with $200 and a fake ID, got 5 to 10. The courtroom was silent. Elizabeth had expected to feel vindicated. Instead, she felt hollow, as though she had just watched a building collapse on someone she used to know. The restitution order was the largest the county had seen in a decade. The judge mandated full recovery from all identifiable assets, including the cryptocurrency accounts that Corrine Foley had painstakingly traced. Within 6 months, Elizabeth's inheritance was restored in full, along with the $25,000 destined for the Senior Assistance Fund. But the real victory was for Ruth Kavanaugh's nephew. David flew to New York for the follow-up hearing, and when the judge ordered the return of his aunt's $40,000, he put his head down and wept. He told Elizabeth later that Ruth had always believed people were fundamentally good, and that seeing her memory honored with justice meant more than the money. As the cases were consolidated, the district attorney's office discovered that Stephanie's spreadsheet contained even older entries, transactions dating back to her early 20s. One name led back to a neighbor whose car had been signed over using a fake power of attorney, and another to a small business whose title had mysteriously shifted ownership. Each of those victims was notified, their fraud finally exposed by the same notary logbooks that had initially failed them. The notary system, long dismissed as a bureaucratic formality, had become the forensic scaffold for an entire web of crimes. The final surprise came not from the courtroom, but from an envelope Elizabeth found in her grandfather's desk while cleaning out the house. It was a letter, written in his shaky handwriting, dated 2 years before his death. He wrote, "I've left you the business money, but I worry about your cousin Stephanie. She's got a hungry look, the kind that eats at people. I set up the trust for the seniors because I know you'll do right by it. Don't let her get close to the paperwork." He had seen it coming. He had seen the hunger and had tried, gently, to warn her. Elizabeth realized that the notary logbook hadn't just caught a fraud, it had completed a conversation her grandfather started but could never finish. She used part of the inheritance to finally buy that house, a small craftsman with a porch and a maple tree in the front yard. The rest of the money went into a fund she named the Hartwell Integrity Initiative, which helps fraud victims navigate the probate system and pay for forensic accounting. The first client was David, and the second was one of the veterans Stephanie had stolen from. Every notary logbook request Elizabeth files for those cases bears a small note. The truth is in the timestamps. The girl who sat in that notary chair decided she would spend the rest of her life ensuring that no one else's chair would be stolen from them. And the cousin who thought she could hide behind a fake ID and a crooked notary learned what Elizabeth's grandfather had always known. Sooner or later, the truth leaves a mark, and that mark has a time and date. There are over 4 million notaries in the United States. Most of them are honest. But as Elizabeth discovered, a single compromise stamp can unravel decades of someone else's hard work. The Hartwell case changed how the district attorney's office now trains investigators to examine notary logs as primary evidence in fraud complaints. And in the 3 years since Stephanie's conviction, 12 states have passed laws requiring digital photo capture and biometric verification for high-value document notarizations. The system, flawed as it still is, has one new weapon: the timestamp that cannot be erased. Elizabeth's fund has now helped 47 families recover over $2 million in fraudulently transferred assets. She told me once that the logbook didn't just catch a crime, it gave her back the voice her grandfather always thought she had. And that quiet warning he wrote, the one she found in the desk, now hangs framed in her home office. It reminds her that sometimes, the people closest to us are the ones most desperate to take what we have. But it also reminds her that vigilance has a name, and hers is written in ink. If this story resonated with you, please take a second to like and subscribe and drop your location plus local time in the comments. I read them, and I love knowing where in the world you're listening from. I'm Juliet. This was the story of how a notary's logbook exposed a serial fraud and how one woman refused to let her cousin steal her future. Until next time, trust the timestamp.